All right, everybody, let's get started here. So our final speaker of the semester, very excited to have Sarah Newkirk from Nature Conservancy, California. And I really like the title here, The Case for Undevelopment, is the final point here. I'm very curious to see where this goes. Sarah has worked with the Center for the Blue Economy for a number of years, worked on a lot of projects, always really enjoyed her insights, and let's give her a warm welcome virtually.
Thanks, Jason. And class, I'm super sorry that I can't be there in person. I get a lot of energy from being in the same room with you guys, and it's just simply not the same being in this kind of cruddy hotel room in Berkeley. But I have an agreement with FEMA, and they're giving me grant money, and that means that I have to go get trained by them. I have not learned a single thing so far, and so doubly sorry that I'm not there with you guys. This presentation that I'm going to give you today is actually two presentations kind of squished into one. When Jason and Rachel told me that I was going to speak to a class that lasts an hour and a half, I nearly fainted because even I don't want to listen to myself talk for an hour and a half. Nor do I have really an hour and a half long talk, but I do have a couple of things to say about the issue of undevelopment, which is a word that we've been sort of batting around as sort of synonymous with managed retreat. The first part of this talk is about power plants, and it's based on a paper that myself and Molly Melius and Sarah Ryder published in, of all things, the Vermont Law Review, which is where you would publish any piece on power plants in California. They were accepted our paper, and so that's where it is. And if anyone's interested in reading the more detailed accounting, I'm happy to send you a PDF. The second part of the presentation is about, believe it or not, the even more challenging proposition of managed retreat in neighborhoods, right? So in areas with residential development. And I'll say a few words about why I think that's more challenging. It is my New Year's resolution to start speak more slowly. It's not the new year yet, and so it is my intention to start applying that here. And especially because I find it very difficult to hear questions and have conversation on these sort of remote presentations. So please do stop me, wave your hands, throw things at the monitor. If you have a question and you want to jump in, I'm very open to taking questions in slides. Don't hesitate for a second. So with that, I'm going to get started. Once when I was about 8, my mother came home with a delicious takeout meal. And they were what you might describe as nuggets. They were deep fried with a delicious mayonnaise-based sauce that appealed to my 8-year-old drive to consume as much fat per sitting as possible. I ate about a dozen of these things before asking my mom specifically what they were, after which she replied that they were calamari, a delicacy that I had heretofore steadfastly refused to eat. And I thought, Mom, it turns out that I love calamari. So this is an age-old parenting strategy. Those of you who are parents may know it. My own children refer to it as cheating. I refer to it as opportunism. And it reflects that controversial things, in this case squid, are easier to digest when accompanied by some other enabling factors, in this case tartar sauce and a fry-later. So in this talk, I want to assert that the same tenet holds true for managed retreat. Specifically the paradigm-changing managed retreat demonstrations that we need that may be more easily accomplished when they occur incidental to some other socially desirable, or in this case, legally mandated outcome. So let me first introduce you to the town of Oxnard, California. Oxnard is a seaside community of about 200,000 people to the north and west of Los Angeles. Parts of the community rank among the most disadvantaged in the state. And according to Cal EnviroScreen, parts have among the highest pollution burden in the state as well. In consequence, the citizens of Oxnard have been struggling against a history of coastal industrial development that is, quite frankly, hard to be rid of. But Oxnard also has an incredible asset. This is Ormond Beach. Ormond Beach represents one of Southern California's few intact and contiguous ecosystems of dunes, wetlands, and uplands. The area hosts more than 200 migratory bird species and provides a buffer against the impact of sea level rise and climate change, making it a unique restoration opportunity for Southern California. The fact that the conserved areas of Ormond Beach are backed primarily by agricultural land means that as sea levels rise, they will likely have room to migrate, especially if those farms can be kept in agriculture through land protection or conservation easements. Our conservation partners have been working to protect and restore Ormond Beach for decades. The Nature Conservancy owns some of it, so does the California State Coastal Conservancy, and so does the city of Oxnard. These groups have been working collectively to develop a restoration and public access plan that will give citizens of Oxnard much more direct access to this coastal gem. But look even closer and you'll see that there is a power plant directly in the middle of all this protected land. Yes, that is a power plant. So here it is close up. The Ormond Beach Generating Station is a 430 megawatt natural gas-fired power plant right smack in the middle of the Ormond Beach complex. The Ormond Beach power plant is called a peaker plant, which means that it's not online all the time. It's only working at periods of peak demand. The Ormond power plant is also a once-through coal power plant, meaning that it cools its generators with seawater. Now, once-through cooling was state-of-the-art in 1959 when the Ormond Beach Generating Station went online, but not anymore. In case you're not familiar with this feat of modern engineering, the idea was to pull cold seawater directly from the ocean, along with all the fish and other critters occupying it, running it across a screen with some lucky fish that can't fit through, and if they win the lottery, they get rerouted back to the ocean. Unfortunately, many instead get impinged on the screen, that is, stuck, killed, and thrown into the garbage. For the smaller fish and larvae and other organisms that actually fit through the screen, they get to witness the process of generator cooling firsthand. Unfortunately, it usually kills them, and they get sent back out into the ocean with the warm seawater. If this is grisly, and it sounds archaic, it is. And it has been illegal, at least on the books, for a long time. Section 316B of the Clean Water Act required that all power plants, new and old, install the best technology available for minimizing the adverse environmental impacts of cooling water intake structures. In 1977, the EPA's first attempt at Section 316B regulations was remanded by the Fourth Circuit due to procedural defects. Apparently, feeling defeated, EPA failed to propose any new cooling water intake regulations for 15 years. In 1993, frustrated with the EPA's inaction and the resulting regulatory vacuum, numerous environmental groups sued the EPA in federal district court to compel issuance of the regulations required by Section 316B. In 1995, the environmental groups won a consent decree ordering the EPA to take final action with respect to Section 316B regulations, which EPA did in 2001, but only halfway. EPA regulations identified closed cycle cooling as the best technology available, but only for new facilities. It wasn't until 2004 that the EPA issued final regulations applying to existing power plants. Unfortunately, the regs weren't very good, so all of this other litigation happened until finally, in 2014, we have best available technology for existing power plants, and it's closed cycle or dry cooling. But look here, in 2010, California and New York got sick of all the BS and wrote their own regulations. Specifically for California, the rule said that the plants needed to upgrade their generators to BTA, or best technology available, or make other accommodations that would reduce the entrainment and impingement mortality, or else they needed to power down. So when enacted in 2010, the once-through cooling phase-out in California affected 19 California power plants. The use of once-through cooling has been phased out from 10 of these power plants, representing about 10,400 megawatts. The retirement of once-through cooling power plants was 6,300 megawatts of capacity is expected by 2020, and the remaining 3,800 megawatts are expected to retire by 2029. So to be clear, there was an opportunity to power down 19 power plants with aging infrastructure and antiquated cooling systems, and for 10 of them already, we didn't do it. We missed the opportunity to reclaim coastal real estate and protect our electrical grid from sea level rise and flooding. Why? Don't we have agencies for this? Where was the great and powerful California Coastal Commission? Well, to answer that question, we need to go back again to ancient history. A few years before the OPEC oil embargo in the early 1970s, California's electric utility companies warned state regulators of a separate impending energy crisis. The problem, according to the utilities, was that regional and local governments in California made it increasingly difficult to site new and necessary power plants. And unless there was legislation to preempt the jurisdiction of local governments and regional agencies for siting new power plant stations, there would be shortages of electricity, with resulting brownouts and blackouts of indefinite duration. We're now feeling a little bit of deja vu, I sense, with our current brownouts and blackouts. In any event, the resulting law, called the Warren-Alquist Act, created the California Energy Commission, which remains California's primary energy policy and planning agency. It sets forth state policies concerning the generation, transmission, and consumption of electrical energy, and also established a comprehensive administrative procedural review for evaluation and certification of power plant sites proposed to meet forecasted power demands. Importantly, the Warren-Alquist Act also sets energy conservation and efficiency standards, which has made California a longtime leader in energy efficiency. In any case, this all happened several years before the Coastal Act was even born. When it was enacted, we were still in the middle of the energy crisis, and the CEC retained almost complete control over power plant siting. Which is not to say that the Coastal Commission doesn't have anything to say about power plant siting. In fact, lots of agencies do. And this table shows you some of the many agencies that have some level of regulatory authority and what that authority actually is. But suffice to say that the Coastal Commission is only empowered to provide input on the process. No permit is issued, and the CEC is free to ignore the input that the Coastal Commission provides. So sometimes the Coastal Commission simply doesn't bother. But we have other ways. The Nature Conservancy doesn't usually advocate for or against any particular project, but we did think that it would be useful for the CEC and the California Public Utilities Commission to know that the plant in Ormond Beach was vulnerable to sea level rise. In fact, our comment letter pointed out that it was vulnerable to flooding even without any sea level rise. And this was just what the community needed. For the reasons I mentioned previously, this was a community that was poised to be, let's say, pissed off about how their shoreline had been treated over the years. To be clear, Oxnard doesn't just have one power plant, it has two. Also a Superfund site and a variety of other industrial pollutants. To the extent that there needed to be any reason to deny the permit beyond environmental justice, with sea level rise, they had it. So the city made their views known, and the Oxnard City Council passed not one, but two moratoria on coastal power plants. The mayor pro tem, the wonderful Carmen Ramirez, told the press, "Why in the world would anyone want to have a critical electrical facility that produces power for the entire region within the coastal flooding zone?" In the background, of course, was the reality that in California, electricity usage peaked in 2008 and has been on a steady decline since. Meanwhile, the energy supply, fueled by the investments made during the energy crisis, continued to trend upward. For more context, California has been seriously considering investing in renewables. So much so that the commitment Governor Brown made to the 100% renewables by 2040 is cool, but not breathtakingly so. We know how to do this. California is a net exporter of renewable energy. So the end of this story is that the CPUC and the CEC both denied the power plant its permits, not just for the Ormond power plant, but also for the Mandalay power plant, which is the other one in Ventura County. Shortly thereafter, GenOn, the subsidiary of NRG that owned and operated these plants, declared bankruptcy. The plants themselves have been or are being decommissioned, or they were until recent rules by the CPUC temporarily extended the life of the Ormond Beach generating plant because Ventura County had done little or nothing to replace that supply of power. So it leaves one to wonder what could have happened if the 10 power plants that were repowered with closed cycle or dry cooling had followed a different narrative. How much retreat could we have seen then? So there's a postscript to this happy ending, and so who in this room has experience with demolishing a power plant? Anybody?
No.
Well, me neither. But because the Nature Conservancy manages so much of the surrounding open space at Ormond Beach, people are looking to us for answers. And in fact, GenOn, some representatives of the bankrupt GenOn, the owner of the power plant, actually reached out to our real estate director to see whether we might be interested in buying a power plant and demolishing it ourselves, or perhaps taking ownership of the restored land once they got through with it. I was heartened to learn that there were conferences like this, conferences on exactly this, like this one in Lexington, Kentucky, and maybe some people who attended that could help us learn something. An even better postscript is while development has the look and feel of permanence, the truth is that we've been doing managed retreat in California for a long time, and then particularly as it concerns energy infrastructure. Most of us don't remember that most of Southern California was developed to accommodate oil production on a massive scale. The top image in this slide is a picture of Huntington Beach in the 1920s, and the bottom is Huntington Beach today. Sometimes development decisions that were the right thing for a particular time and place turn out wrong for one reason or another as time marches on. And with that, I'm going to take a quick breather to see whether you guys have any questions or want to discuss any of this relating to the power plants before I move on to the harder issue of residential development.
Sure. Sarah, do you know about the Moss Landing power plant? Now, the big one that we see in front was decommissioned. But as I understand, there's a smaller one behind it. And do you know if that one is operating, is using some better type of intake and output cooling mechanism? Yeah,
I think that's been the plan for a lot of the power plants that have been repowered. And it's actually not a terrible thing. And I've made lots of derogatory comments about this because I don't like the idea of these power plants staying on the coast. But the truth is that where the companies can repurpose existing intake and outflow structures, the pipes and so forth, that's certainly a better approach than building anything new. And so to the extent that some of them are trying to co-locate with desalination facilities that also need to draw in seawater, that's great. And also the footprint of the site, the pad and everything, it makes sense to repurpose those where they can. I think increasingly we're seeing sort of redevelopment of these sites with smaller sort of battery storage facilities behind existing infrastructure. And I think that some more local or regional battery storage is exactly what we need to get more microgrid electrical technology. But at this point, starting to venture into unknown territory for me. And so I'll wrap up my answer there. Does that help?
Somewhat, yeah.
Anybody else?
So, are you guys taking any steps to pursue ownership of the power plants and demolish it?
Yeah, well, I think that demolishing it is what I would like to avoid. And so the discussions that we've been having with GenOn so far they've presented a variety of options. One might be to take ownership and control of the site with the plant still standing, and they've We haven't obviously discussed detailed price points, and we're not going to now for another couple of years because of the extension. But the conversation has been sort of in broad terms whether we might like to take it for free with the power plant on it and then take control of the demolition ourselves, or whether we would rather take control of the underlying land after the demolition, which might actually cost something. There is a paper out there from the early 2010s by Resources for the Future, which actually took a stab at case studies of power plant demolitions and restoration projects. And I think that the cost of those things run in the neighborhood of $50 million. And so you can imagine why we don't want to do it ourselves. And I think you can also imagine why GenOn isn't in a really big hurry to do it either. What is really breathtaking to me is that there's no, as far as we're able to tell, there's no bond or anything that the company filed with the state that creates liability for them in terms of that demolition and restoration. Since the creation of the State Lands Commission, often when an industrial facility uses, in particular, coastal land that is basically owned by the state for the benefit of the people of California, they will pay a bond that will then either sort of, it's almost like a cleaning deposit when you rent an apartment. If you either you clean it up and you get the bond back, or you don't clean it up and the state can use the bond to pay for the remediation.
Wow.
Does that help?
So the power plant in Oxnard, they literally can just declare bankruptcy and walk away, and they have no legal liability.
That part, I wouldn't go that far. I think that there would be liability certainly under nuisance law, and so I think that there's a real risk, and there's a reason that they're talking to us, and the reason that they're sort of scoping out all these options as opposed to just walking away. So yeah, I think that there are a number of provisions in common law that would create liability with them. It's just not clear that there's nothing in the law that says when power plants are retired, they shall do whatever.
I have a question relating to the stacks in Morro Bay and how, because those have been decommissioned for longer, I think, and they still stand. So in my mind, if they are still standing, how long can we expect the one in Oxnard to stand then?
I don't know, and I think that a lot of these, the retirement decisions have been very, very case specific. No story resembles any other story, and I think that a lot of the sort of motivation in Oxnard is being obviously driven by the community activists, and I think that and the community activists supported by the city government. The city government has just taken, I think, a really sort of vigorous interest in this issue. Again, driven by the ownership of the beach area and their interest in, I think, economic revitalization that might be driven by tourism instead of industry. Any other questions?
Doesn't look like it.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. So, at least with power plants, there was this enabling factor, right? It's just like the tartar sauce and the squid analogy. What we don't have is a similar enabling factor when it comes to residential development. I think that you likely heard that conversations on managed retreat in communities where the residential development has been incredibly fraught here in California, and a large part of that has been driven by regulations promulgated by the California Coastal Commission. So one of the things that we've been doing at the Nature Conservancy is evaluating this question of whether it's possible to go into a community and have a civil conversation about managed retreat that recognizes the interest of the homeowners in the area to stay in their homes as long as they possibly can, while simultaneously confronting the reality that in some places there's really almost no future that doesn't necessitate some level of retreat. So obviously in an era of climate change and increasingly frequent and destructive natural disasters, there are these places where moving out of harm's way is simply the best choice from a health, safety, economic, and environment standpoint. And this is what I'm referring to as managed retreat. It not only benefits affected people by helping them out of high hazard zones, but it also provides a societal benefit as costs to taxpayers and insurance rate payers are likely to be reduced in the long run by it. It also could provide space to create natural buffers to protect nearby communities and restore ecological function in high hazard zones. So the media has obviously been talking about managed retreat for a while now, and particularly big disasters have hit different parts of this country. And local governments have begun to have these kinds of difficult conversations with their constituents as the economic ramifications of adaptation have become more and more clear. Just last week, the New York Times published an article about the Florida Keys and how local officials are approaching these adaptation questions and conversation, and concluding that the economic picture of elevating and adapting some roads just doesn't make sense, and retreat in some form or another is going to have to be a part of their strategy going forward. Did anyone see that Times article?
Yeah.
It's definitely worth a look. Florida is one of those places where the managed retreat conversation has just simply not been being had. And I think that it's only really when the economic drivers, when the economic consequences of doing some of these infrastructure adaptations has really hit home. As you're all very aware, we're not without risk here in California, and FEMA has been mapping our floodplains since the 1970s, for good or bad, and tracking insurance claims against the National Flood Insurance Program, which was approved by Congress in 1968. Now this map shows FEMA's 100-year and 500-year floodplain for Southern California, and you're obviously not at UCLA, so this is a slide that's repurposed from a previous presentation. You're not at UCLA. But this shows FEMA's 100 and 500-year floodplains for Southern California, and it also shows repetitive loss properties. These are the dots in pink. And the size of the dot reflects the number of claims that have been paid out against their flood insurance in any rolling 10-year period. FEMA defines these repetitive flood loss properties as any with 2 or more flood claims in a 10-year period. And again, the bigger the pink circle, the more claims they filed. So while the flood insurance program is supposed to be covered by premiums, and FEMA has had to borrow from the U.S. Treasury to cover more losses, particularly following major disasters, and it pays back these loans with interest at the cost to the U.S. taxpayer. It's been estimated by most economists that the federal flood insurance program is never going to be solvent ever again. So that's bad news for the American taxpayer. So what all these disasters have in common is that nature has a critical role to play in keeping our communities safe. TNC researchers found that after Hurricane Sandy, coastal wetlands prevented more than $625 million in property damage, reducing overall property damages throughout the Northeast U.S. by 10% on average. Now, the Nature Conservancy's program in coastal resilience, at least in California, has recently evolved into a sort of a broader disaster resilience program. And this is not to suggest that we're not still working on coastal resilience. In fact, this entire talk is likely about coastal resilience. But we are taking part in project development and planning around a broader suite of natural disasters. And someday it might be fun to give you guys a talk on some of what we're doing in fire. I'll mention some of that later on in this talk. But what we're trying to do is reimagine development. in the context of growing climate risk. The first thing that we're doing is recognizing the critical role for nature and how we prepare for and recover from these disasters. Nature provides a buffer for communities, but it needs space to be able to provide this protection. In California and lots of other places around the country, we've built and continue to build right up to in our hazard zones. And this is particularly true along our very urban Southern California coastline. So to protect communities and regain this critical buffer, it may mean moving some development and other things out of harm's way so we can restore nature's protection. So FEMA Region 9 shares an interest with the Nature Conservancy in having nature-based solutions be a part of hazard mitigation. Hazard mitigation is another word for, well, in many cases, hazard mitigation projects that are nature-based would look very much like natural restoration projects to most people. So we're now what we call a cooperating technical partner with FEMA in Region 9. And it is for this reason that I'm here in Oakland doing a 3-day-long training on how to be a cooperating technical partner with Region 9. This is also a first for the Nature Conservancy. In order to help change how FEMA invests in nature-based projects that help reduce risk to disasters. We're working with FEMA directly in changing how they evaluate natural infrastructure projects through their benefit cost calculator, with a new version of which has recently come out. We're also working with the state emergency agency, or Cal OES, the Office of Emergency Services, and how it evaluates big nature-based restoration projects and gets those projects through to FEMA for rapid hazard mitigation funding. We're also working with communities on FEMA's new hazard mitigation grant program that they're calling BRIC, or Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program. Now, BRIC is really interesting because it is the first in a series of wonderful amendments to the Stafford Act, which is the act that governs mitigation funding through FEMA. BRIC is actually increasing the amount of mitigation money that is going to be available to communities pre-disaster. Basically what it does is sets aside 6% of all disaster funding into the mitigation category and makes that available to the states. And it's going to be the state's first opportunity to have a real dedicated and consistent pile of funding that it can use to pursue mitigation projects pre-disaster. But then the last bucket of work that we're doing under our FEMA project is this managed retreat project. And we kind of got this through FEMA without really paying a lot of attention. It's not at all clear that FEMA necessarily wants to be involved in managed retreat, although FEMA has done literally thousands of buyouts across the country. The reason FEMA engages in buyouts is to get properties off of their flood insurance rolls when their properties are costing a lot of money in claims. They're not particularly interested in sort of community-wide planning for a managed retreat. So we're doing 2 investigations sort of under the radar of FEMA that will, we think, promote a broader view of managed retreat with FEMA. And one of those projects is a fire-related risk reduction project in Paradise, California, where the site of the Camp Fire last year. And the other is this project that I'll talk about in more detail in Long Beach. So, but let me just quickly first mention this Paradise project because it's pretty interesting and cool. We've just executed a cooperative agreement with the Paradise Recreation and Parks District in which we'll be advancing the science of wildfire risk reduction boundaries, exploring innovative finance mechanisms for land acquisition, and using our shared lessons learned to influence wildfire-related policies at the state level, such as promoting state funding for open spaces around communities that can help protect fire-prone communities and keeping development out of these highly flammable areas. In this effort, the Town of Paradise will lead the charge to bring the community along with these new ideas for fire risk reduction, and the Nature Conservancy will provide financial, technical, and policy expertise to support the immediate needs locally. So our mutual goal is that we can create pathways for the community of Paradise to take actions that will reduce the risk of another catastrophic fire while also providing increased public access to the natural areas surrounding Paradise, or the restored areas surrounding Paradise. We also hope that this model of a community-driven approach to fire risk reduction that has conservation benefits can be appealing to other fire-prone communities throughout California. So let's get on to this work on, actually let me take a quick pause there, just because I'm not going to talk anymore about the fire project. Does anybody have any questions about that?
No, just one quick comment about just the power of language. It has always bothered me that this is called the campfire, not the PG&E fire. From the very first, it was kind of spun without their liability, and I just wanted to put that out there. I'm going to start calling it the PG&E fire anytime I hear about it.
Yeah, it's a good point, and so the project that we've just gotten involved with the Parks and Recreation District, when we first started talking to them, they had been under the impression that they were going to receive something on the order of $40 million for land acquisition pursuant to the PG&E settlement. And then, of course, that got put on hold when PG&E declared bankruptcy. And as PG&E has been coming out of bankruptcy, it's been sort of up in the air as to whether the Recreation and Parks District would actually receive that funding. And if they did not receive that funding, how else could we finance the acquisitions that will result in this natural buffer open space for our community? But we just heard just the other day when the PG&E settlement was announced and finalized that I think that we will the funding will be made available to this town, which is really great.
Oh, good. Great.
Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts on the fire?
We got one over here.
Yeah, just one real quick. I was curious, in this plan for management, is there any plan to incorporate tribal and indigenous methods of fire management? I don't know very much about that at all. So what we're talking about is strictly, and I this is not to bring you too deeply into the quagmire that it's like TNC's organizational structure. The sustainable forest management, right, the prescribed burning, is conducted by a completely other, like interaction with communities on those strategies is conducted by a completely other sort of branch of the Nature Conservancy than the one that I'm in. My program sits in the cities program. My strategy sits in the cities program. So all of this is really about how we envision future development and how we rethink current development in order to create long-term climate resilience. So I don't know the answer to your question. I sort of assume that my forestry colleagues are at least aware of the answer if in the event that the answer is not yes. So I'm sorry that I can't really answer that question. That's okay, thank you.
Sure. Anything else? I also should point out about the fire program that the science around whether sort of these open space protection and management programs is consistent with risk reduction to communities is by no means clear yet, right? I think the first thing that we needed to do pursuant to this project is really get a consultant to help us sort of like settle this issue of whether open space near a community is good or bad for fire risk. And there's been, I think, a lot of debate about this recently in the press. And if you read the Los Angeles Times, I think that you've seen a good bit of back and forth about sort of that inconsistency. But we've partnered with the Conservation Biology Institute on basically doing a literature review on sort of what's known about
open space and fire risk reduction. And it's fairly convincing, at least to me, that buffers can be constructed and designed with an eye to sort of risk reduction for a community. And so our next step on this project is really going to be to to do exactly that, to design that buffer. How wide does it have to be? What kind of management practices have to be in place in order to make the risk reduction role of it come to fruition? So I just wanted to sort of put that out there, that I'm not asserting that this is like settled science by any stretch of the imagination. We've done a lit review, we're doing some modeling, and so stay tuned. This is a project that's in development. So onto the Long Beach project. So the Nature Conservancy has been partnering with the Aquarium of the Pacific on this project in Long Beach to create opportunities for community dialogue around sea level rise and pathways to a more resilient Long Beach, both in the near term and for future generations. Now, the goals of this partnership for us, the Nature Conservancy, are to understand residents' concerns about the future of the area, their perspectives on potential scenarios to enhance resilience of the coastal area, including the possibility for managed retreat down the road. Because we're partnering with the Aquarium of the Pacific, which is sort of the local convener for some of these listening sessions, we have to recognize that the aquarium's goals for these sessions may not be 100% aligned with the Nature Conservancy's. And that has been something that we've had to be very explicit about in the conversations with these communities, right? So one of the things that we think is really critical to having these civil conversations within a community about something as challenging as managed retreat is to have the goals of the project really laid out up front. And because our goals were not perfectly aligned with the aquarium's goals, we had to sort of say what they were. Nature Conservancy's goals is obviously to really understand the concerns and perspectives, the tractability of potential approaches, and a lexicon for engagement in other communities around this issue of managed retreat. And if we can, to develop a model for best practices for how those engagements can occur. Now, the aquarium's goals, because they're the local partner and they're much more sort of invested in how the planning for the community over the long term actually plays out. Their goals are really to keep people in those communities. They're much more reflective of what the community's goals are themselves, to keep those people in those houses as long as they can, but also to plan for a long game. And that's important because managed retreat is explicit in that goal, but it's not immediate. It's explicit, but not immediate. So then the second of the aquarium's goals would be to identify adaptation pathways for the area, both in short and long-term perspectives. And then it's similar to the Nature Conservancy's productive community dialogues through understanding community perspective. I'll also say that the aquarium is not our only partner in the project. We're also partnering with the Art Center School of Design, and these are basically planning and design students, landscape design students, and they're really helping us. We've found that in engaging with communities, almost the worst thing that you can do is just show them pictures of their vulnerability. And so it was clear that we need to show vulnerability together with potential solutions in order to have the dialogue not crash before it even got started. And so we've had a couple of these listening sessions now. We first had a planning session with a couple of members of the community where they made it clear what we were likely to hear about from others in the community. We followed that up by a large presentation session. We had Gary Griggs, who is a professor at UPSC and one of California's great experts on the impacts of sea level rise from a physical science perspective. And we educated the community about what the implications of sort of the sea level rise projections actually were for the community. But then what you're looking at here is a session that just happened a couple of weeks ago, a listening session focus group. And this was a smaller group of interested members of the community. Now, one of the things you'll observe about this group is that they're almost universally white and almost universally either retired or near thereto. I'll disclaim this at least somewhat by saying that the Nature Conservancy did not take part in selecting the individual participants. The way we went about selecting participants for this listening session was we turned it over to the editor of the Grunion Gazette, which is really the local newspaper, and we got that person to identify groups that were really the community leaders and that could represent diverse interests of the community. And those leaders then were the ones to attend the listening session. And so we have to own the fact that we're talking to a not very diverse group of people, and the group itself owned that in the listening session. They said, listen, it's really important for us to have younger perspectives in the room and more diverse perspectives from sort of a demographic perspective as well. So we do think, however, that turning over participation selection to a local leader is the best practice that comes from this. And so we sort of stand by that decision. In the future, though, we'll recognize that we want that broader diversity. So in terms of like the Nature Conservancy's goals, that is to take lessons learned on how to have a successful conversation about managed retreat, these are just some observations about what we're learning early on. And again, we've only had a couple of these sessions. For the most part, we haven't really talked about the details of managed retreat yet because we've been really focused on what some of the shorter term solutions actually are going to be. But some of our early observations are that probably the most important thing to having a conversation that doesn't fail before it's even gotten off the ground is to start with those influential partners with deep community roots. The person at the head of this group here is Jerry Schubel, who's the director of the Aquarium of the Pacific. And he is deeply, deeply ingrained in this community and is very popular. And so he's a perfect person to really lead this engagement, and he's got deep roots in the community. I'm going to talk about virtual reality in a second, but it's important to have to really create the opportunity for community members to really visualize both their risks and the solutions. And when we talk about virtual reality, it really is about opening up those conversations about both risks and solutions. It's not particularly about the technology in and of itself.